Chapter 1 Scum. Proud Immortal Demon Wei was a male power fantasy of a stallion novel. To be more specific, Proud Immortal Demon Wei was a monster-fighting, escapist cultivation novel with an incomparably ridiculous length, a golden finger that broke every rule, and a harem size nearing 3 digits, seeing as every single female character fell for the protagonist. This year's hottest stallion novel, there was no other. The male lead of this novel, Luo Binghe, was neither the kind who started heroic and invincible like a proud dragon of the heavens, nor the kind who was a loser, a good-for-nothing without merit. Yet he managed to trend with tens of thousands of readers on Zhongdian literature, inspiring countless other male fantasy novels to follow in his footsteps. He was the kind of lead who was pitch black, dark and vicious, though before his heart blackened, he was the kind who suffered misery after misery. Next, let a veteran reader of the novel Shen Yuan omit the countless fan-servicey details and concisely summarize the million-word epic for everyone. Immediately after birth, Luo Binghe was abandoned by his parents, swaddled in a white cloth and put in a wooden basin that was lowered into the Luo River. This occurred on the coldest days of the year. It was only thanks to fishermen pulling him out of the water that he didn't freeze to death as a baby. Because he'd been drifting along the Luo in the season when it was choked with thin ice, he was given the name Luo Binghe. Luo Binghe spent his early years wandering the streets, hungry and cold, a dreary childhood. A washerwoman who worked for a wealthy family took pity on him, and since she had no children of her own, she adopted and raised him as her own. Mother and son were poor, and they suffered much humiliation at the hand of their rich patrons. Growing up in such an unhealthy environment became the foundation of Luo Binghe's future twisted personality post-darkening. His inclinations to fight over every scrap, seek revenge for the smallest grievance, and hide a murderous intent behind a smile. Once he withstood the beatings of the family's young masters for a bowl of lukewarm meat congee. In the end, he was still too late, and he failed to give his adopted mother even a single taste before she died. By complete coincidence, he was selected for training by one of the cultivation world's 4 greatest sects, Changchong Mountain. There he apprenticed under the Xinya sword, Shangqingqiu. Luo Binghe thought he could finally start on the righteous path. He couldn't have expected that Shangqingqiu was fair without but foul within, trash of the lowest caliber. Shangqingqiu was jealous of Luo Binghe's unparalleled and exceptional talent, and he secretly feared his disciple, whose cultivation improved by leaps and bounds every day. He always found ways to taunt and demean Luo Binghe, even enlisting the boy's peers to belittle him. Throughout these days of studying, Luo Binghe endured every humiliation. It was another heart-wrenching arc in his story, filled with blood and tears. After much difficulty, Luo Binghe managed to turn 17, at which point he finally participated in the event the cultivation world held once every 4 years, the Immortal Alliance Conference. However, at the conference, Luo Binghe fell victim to Shangqingqiu's scheming, and he tumbled into a crack in the boundary between the human and the demon realms, the endless abyss. That's right, only then did the story truly begin. Not only did Luo Binghe survive, but within the endless abyss he found his personal sword, the peerless mystical blade Xinmu. He also learned the truth of his origins. As it turned out, Le Binghe had been born to the demon realm's saintly ruler and a woman of the human realm. Within his veins flowed the blood of the ancient, heaven-fallen demons, as well as that of the human race. His birth father, Tianlangjun, had been sealed beneath a great mountain, trapped for all eternity. His birth mother had been a disciple from a righteous cultivation sect, but shortly following Tianlangjun's sealing, she had been expelled on suspicion of having secret ties to demons. She had died from a postpartum hemorrhage after giving birth to Le Binghe, but prior to her death, she had set her son adrift from the lonely ship she'd birthed him on. It was the only way she had been able to give Le Binghe a chance to survive. Le Binghe used Shenmo to release his body's seal on his demonic blood. Then, within the dark abyss, he single-mindedly cultivated and enlightened himself to otherworldly techniques before heading back to Changcheng Mountain Sect. From there on out, Le Binghe steadily headed down his dark path, never looking back. Every single one of his old enemies suffered great torment and died a horrible death by the sand. With his steadily improving ability to lie and scheme, Le Binghe won the trust of many people, feigning compliance while secretly plotting against them. He seized power and arose in position, beginning a reign of terror. As the story unfolded, Le Binghe's heart blackened further and further. He returned to the demon realm and inherited the position of saintly ruler. Yet unsatisfied, he began to eradicate each one of the human realm's great righteous sects, bathing them in blood and annihilating all who opposed him. In the end, Le Binghe became a legend spoken of for generations of immortals and demons, hailed for his unification of the three realms, the uncountable size of his harem, and his boundless number of descendants. Dumbfuck author, dumbfuck novel! With his dying breath, Shen Yuan spat this final curse. Who could have imagined that an upstanding young man like him, who had properly purchased the website's VIP currency and read the novel's official version, would find himself persevering before his untimely death to finish a novel so stallion, so money-grabbing, and overly padded that it left him speechless with rage? How could he not curse? Proud immortal demon way by airplane shooting towards the sky. Just looking at that euphemistic handle smacked you in the face with a dirty feeling. Grade school level writing with landmines everywhere, breaking all suspension of disbelief? And Shen Yuan couldn't bear to call that incoherent mess of a world the author had built a cultivation setting. What kind of cultivation world had people using horses and carriages all day? What kind of cultivation world had people who, after achieving Enidia, still needed to eat and sleep? What kind of cultivation world had an author who occasionally mixed up even the stages of foundation, establishment, and nascent soul? When faced with the protagonist, every single character acted like his total edgelord aura had devoured their intelligence. Especially Lu Binghe's master, Sheng Qingqiu, that idiot amongst idiots, scum among scum. His only purpose was to dig his own grave, and he hadn't even managed to finish before he was killed by the protagonist instead. So why had Shen Yuan started this book, even going so far as to read it to the very end? Don't misunderstand. Shen Yuan didn't enjoy degrading himself. The reason he had persisted was also what had caused him the most frustration. This novel had an incredible amount of foreshadowing, plot lines everywhere, mystery after mystery, layer upon layer of red herrings. And at the very end, not a single one paid off. It was enough to make him want to puke a fountain of blood. Why were priceless herbs, spirits, elixirs, and peerless beauties everywhere like they didn't cost a cent? Why were the villains' speeches and poses as they dug their graves and got offed all exactly the same? The dozens of maidens barely glimpsed, all of whom agreed to enter the harem? What happened to them? Alright, skipping that last one for the moment, who had been the culprit behind the scores of atrocities? Exactly what was the purpose of the unending list of characters so hyped up for being awesome and without equal? Why did none of them make an appearance even at the very end? Towards the sky, bro. Airplane, bro. Great master. Can we have a discussion? Fill in plot holes, okay? Shen Yuan felt like he could have come back to life with the power of sheer rage. In the endless darkness, a mechanical voice sounded by his ear. Activation code, dumbfuck author, dumbfuck novel, system automatically triggered. The tone reminded him of Google Translate. Who is this? Shen Yuan looked around. It seemed like he was floating in a virtual space, one so dark that he couldn't see his hand before him. The voice came from all directions. Welcome to the system. The system operates in line with the design concept, you can, you up, no can, no BB. We hope to provide you with the best possible experience. It is our sincere wish that during your time you can fulfill your desires and, in accordance with your wish, transform a stupid work into a magnificent, high-quality, first-rate classic. We hope you enjoy. In the midst of his ensuing vertigo, a man's voice asked lightly beside him, Shidi? Shidi, can you hear me? Shen Yuan shuddered and settled his mind, forcibly peeling open his eyes. The scene that appeared before him was a massive, whirling flurry. It took a while for everything to finally coalesce, and slowly became clear. He lay on a bed. Looking up, a wide, gauzy canopy hung overhead, with finely crafted perfume pouches dangling from the four corners. Looking down, he wore a white robe of an ancient style. Next to the pillow lay a paper fan. Looking to his left, a handsome, elegant young man dressed in Xuanduan formal robes sat by his bedside, looking at him with concern. Shen Yuan closed his eyes, then sharply reached for that folding fan and opened it with a snap. He lightly waved it, fanning away the cold sweat pouring down his face. The man's eyes lit up with joy. Shidi finally woke up, he said warmly. Do you have any discomfort? Nothing too bad, Shen Yuan said with some reservation. The information overload was a bit too much. He dazedly tried to sit up. As he did, the man quickly reached out to support his back, letting him lean against a headboard. Having read many of Zhongzhuan's Transmigration novels, Shen Yuan had long ago resolved that if he one day woke up to find himself lying in a strange place, the first words out of his mouth before he understood what was happening definitely wouldn't be a carefree giggle and, Are you filming a movie? The props look so real. Your crew is really giving it their all, i.e. the words of a person slow-wittedly trying to find their footing. Rather, Shen Yuan concentrated on acting like he'd just woken up, expression absent-minded. Where is this? The man startled. Did you sleep yourself into a trance? This is here, Qingqing Peak. Internally, Shen Yuan was shocked, but he continued to act muddledly. Why was I asleep for so long? That's what I wanted to ask you. You were in perfect health, so how did you suddenly come down with such a high fever? I know that with the Immortal Alliance conference approaching, you've been training your disciples and are anxious to see results. By the Xiang Mountain. Wow, you're doing really great, babe. Cut! I know that with the Immortal Alliance conference approaching, you've been training your disciples and are anxious to see results, but with Xiang Mountain being such a well-established and renowned sect, even if one of our own didn't attend this time, no one would dare question us. Why concern yourself with empty words? The more Shen Yuan listened, the more something felt off. Why did those lines feel so familiar? No, why did this setup seem so familiar? The Man's next sentence, single and earnest, confirmed all of his suspicion. Qingqiu Shidi, are you listening to Xiang? At this moment something dinged, and the mechanical Google Translate-like voice from his dreamscape spoke again. The system was successfully activated. Bound roll, Luo Binghe's master, Changcheng Mountain Sect Peak Lord of Qingjing Peak, Sheng Qingqiu. Weapon, the sword Shuya. Starting B points, 100. Fuck! What bullshit is this? How come you're speaking directly into my brain? Does airplane shooting towards the sky know you're plagiarizing proud immortal demon way setting like this? Of course, Shen Yuan didn't say this out loud, but the voice swiftly responded. You have triggered the system's execution command and have been bound to the Sheng Qingqiu account. As the plot progresses, various point types will gradually become available. Please ensure that no score falls below 0, or the system will automatically mete out punishment. Stop! Enough! Shen Yuan was sure now he'd hit the jackpot. He'd transmigrated. Transmigrated into a story he'd just finished. Moreover, even if it was a pitch-black stallion novel he'd hated, and even if it came with some kind of shitty system, as a 21st century veteran VIP reader of Zhongyan literature, Shen Yuan had read various types of do-over and transmigration male power fantasy novels year in and year out. So, theoretically, he could have happily and easily accepted this fact. But, of all people, the shell he was boring just happened to belong to the male lead's Scum villain master, Shen Qingqiu. This, made the situation rather complicated. The amicable-looking elder brother type beside him was Changchong Mountain Sect current leader, Shen Qingqiu's Xiang, the Xuanzu sword, Yue Qingyuan. Fuck. There was a very important reason why Shen Yuan empathetically thought fuck at the sight of Yu Qingyuan. In the original work, Yu Qingyuan's death had been caused by his good shidi, Shen Qingqiu, okay? And what a horrific death it was. Tens of thousands of arrows had pierced him until not even his bones remained. At this moment, the victim was facing his own murderer and showering him with concern. The pressure was immense. On second glance, though, the story hadn't yet unfolded to that point. Yu Qingyuan was still in perfect health, meaning that at this point in time, Shen Qingqiu had yet to reveal himself as a hypocrite, and his reputation was still pristine. Yu Qingyuan was a bleeding heart, nothing to be afraid of, though his character ended up suffering quite a bit during his read. Shen Yuan had been rather fond of him. He was just about to relax when a string of words floated eerily to the forefront of his mind. Within the dark, gloomy room, a metal chain hung from a beam. At the end of the chain dangled a ring. The ring was fastened around a person's waist, if it could still be considered a person. This person's appearance was filthy and disheveled, like that of a madman. The most frightening thing about him was that all 4 of his limbs had been severed. His shoulders and thighs were only 4 bare knobs of flesh. When touched, he would let out a hoarse sound. His tongue had been torn out too, rendering him unable to form complete words. Proud immortal demon Wei, a selected passage on Shen Qingqiu's fate. Shen Qingqiu rested his forehead on his hand. He was in no position to lament the horrors of other people's deaths. The most horrific death was his own, okay? Henceforth, he had to avoid any critical errors. First, eliminate any mistake at the root. Second, from now on, cling madly to the male lead's thighs. Third, be a good mentor and helpful friend who is earnest and gentle in his teachings. Meticulously show the male lead every kind of concern. The moment Shen Qingqiu had these thoughts, A long string of alarms erupted in his mind, as if 100 police cars carrying 100 shrieking divine beasts were zooming past. It was so cacophonous that he shuddered, clutching his head in pain. "Shidi, does your head still hurt?" Ye Qingyuan asked worriedly. Teeth clenched, Shen Qingqiu didn't answer. "Warning," the system shrilly notified him. "This proposed plan is incredibly dangerous and qualifies as a violation. Please do not attempt, or the system will automatically mete out punishment." How was that a violation? "Currently, you are at the beginner level and the OOC feature is frozen. You must complete a beginner level quest to unfreeze it. Before unfreezing, any act in violation of the original Shen Qingqiu character setting will result in a deduction of a fixed number of B points." As a semi-otaku, Shen Qingqiu had seen a number of fanwork-related terms here and there, you know what I mean, so of course he knew the definition of OOC. Adjective acronym for out of character, defined as breaking character or acting in a way inconsistent with the character's canonical personality. In other words, before that, whatever feature gets unfrozen, my behavior and actions can't differ from what Shen Qingqiu would do? Correct. This system had already let him transmigrate into Shen Qingqiu's shell, replacing him, but it still cared about a little detail like being OOC? You just said something about how the points can't fall below 0. If they do, what happens? You will automatically be deported back to your original world. Original world? But in Shen Yuan's original world, his body had already expired. In other words, if he lost all of his B or whatever points, what awaited him was, in short, death. Well, if he just ignored the male lead and avoided doing anything, things would be fine, right? He raised his head and scanned the room, but among the disciples waiting on him by his bedside, he didn't see anyone that matched Lu Binghe's description. Feigning unconcern, he said, "Where is Lu Binghe?" Ye Qingyuan paused, giving him a strange look. Shen Qingqiu remained straight-faced, but was secretly filled with glee. Was it possible that the time wasn't ripe? That the male lead had yet to apprentice to Changjiang Mountain sect? "Shidi, don't be angry," said Ye Qingyuan. An ominous premonition stirred in Shen Qingqiu's heart. Ye Qingyuan sighed. "I know you don't like him, but that child's already worked hard enough, and he hasn't made any significant mistakes. Don't punish him any further, all right?" Hearing this, Shen Qingqiu's lips felt dry. He wet them and said, "You can just say it. Where is he?" Ye Qingyuan was silent for a moment. "Whenever you finish stringing him up and beating him, haven't you always shot him in the woodshed?" Shen Qingqiu's vision went dark. In his previous life, Shen Yuan had been well off, growing up, and he'd basically qualified as a modest example of a second-generation rich kid. His 2 older brothers had been set to inherit the family business, and he doted on his little sister. The entire family had been very close. From early on, he'd known that even if he idled the rest of his life away, he'd never want for food. Perhaps due to this carefree upbringing, devoid of either competition or pressure, he came to believe that ranking in the top 10 of a competition was good enough, so as long as it had more than 10 people. Therefore, he'd never understood what scum villains like Shen Qingqiu were thinking as they dug their own graves. The original Shen Qingqiu had both training and cultivation, and the qualifications to prove his experience, not to mention the self-restraint to put up a facade. He wanted for neither standing nor reputation, and with the support of the world's largest sect, he would never want for money either. So why did he have not even a speck of the poise expected of an immortal? Why did he act like one of those bitter courtyard complex concubines with too much time on their hands? Why was he so unable to tolerate the main character, no matter how innocuous his behavior? And why did he spend day in and day out scheming up new torments for him, even getting others to do so in his place? Even if Lu Binghe was blessed with heavenly talent, and even if his aptitude was exceptional to the point that he was more or less cheating, there was still no need to envy him to that extent, you know? Still, the blame didn't really lie with Cheng Qingqiu, it lay with the author. These types of villains were everywhere in the novel, as numerous as carp in a river. It was just that Cheng Qingqiu's character had been especially detailed and especially rotten. What could you do, though? The ultimate boss in this book was the protagonist himself. How could a firefly outshine the sun and moon? The cultivation world had dubbed Cheng Qingqiu the Shuya sword, so naturally he had the appearance and bearing to match. Even now, glancing left and right into a blurry bronze mirror, Cheng Qingqiu was quite satisfied with what he saw. It was a fine-featured face with pitch-black eyes and brows, thin nose and lips, and a mostly scholarly air. Combined with a slender body and long legs, he could more or less be considered beautiful. Though his real age was unclear, this was a cultivation novel. Cheng Qingqiu had achieved mid-core formation, which meant he'd perfectly preserved his youthful appearance. He was certainly many times better looking than Xin Yuan's headcanon for him. He still couldn't compare to Lu Binghe. The moment Cheng Qingqiu thought of Lu Binghe, he was instantly struck with a pounding headache. He wanted to go see Lu Binghe, who was currently shut in the woodshed, but as soon as he took a single step, that ear-piercing notification rang once more in his mind. Warning! OOC warning! Cheng Qingqiu would not take the initiative to visit Lu Binghe. Fine. I'll get someone else to bring him. No problem there, right? Cheng Qingqiu snapped. He thought for a moment, then called, Mingfan! A youth around 16 years old, tall and thin, promptly ran in through the door. This disciple is here. What instructions does Shifu have? Cheng Qingqiu couldn't help but send a couple more glances his way. Mingfan's appearance was respectable enough. It was just that his face was a bit unfortunate, with a sharp mouth and sunken cheeks. Initially, Cheng Qingqiu tusked and lamented, as expected for classic cannon fodder. This was the most senior of the original Cheng Qingqiu's disciple, Lu Binghe's Xiang, Mingfan. This was also the legendary lowest level of cannon fodder. Needless to say, when it came to things like locking Lu Binghe out of the dorms late at night or feeding him false techniques on purpose, Mingfan was the ever-present perpetrator. Whenever Cheng Qingqiu felt inclined to torment Lu Binghe, Mingfan was always his most useful assistant and most enthusiastic supporter. Knowing that this child's fate in the original work wasn't much better than his own, Cheng Qingqiu couldn't help but look at him with the pitying gaze of a fellow victim. Go bring Binghe here. Cut. Go bring Binghe here. Mingfan was plainly unnerved. Whenever Cheng Qingqiu had called for Lu Binghe in the past, he'd always referred to him as that little beast, or ungrateful brat, this wretch, or whelp. He'd hardly ever used Lu Binghe's full name more than a few times. Where had this sudden change come from? But Mingfan didn't dare question a command from his Shifu. He jogged to the woodshed right away and kicked the door twice. Get out! Shizun's calling for you. Cheng Qingqiu paced within his room, exhaustively examining the system within his mind. B points, also known as points awarded for being a badass. The more B points one accrues, the more magnificent, high quality, and first-rate the work has become. Then how can I raise my B points? 1. Change the nonsensical plot and raise the average IQ of the villains and supporting characters. 2. Avoid landmines that break suspension of disbelief. 3. Ensure the main character's satisfaction points. 4. Discover and finish hidden plot events. Cheng Qingqiu analyzed each option one by one. In short, not only did he have to clean up the original Cheng Qingqiu's messes, the Cheng Qingqiu who'd had a veritable mob of enemies coming for his ass, he also had to stop other characters from creating more messes. Didn't even know if he could preserve his own sorry life, and here he still needed to ensure that the main character preserved his OP-ness, time in the spotlight, and harem size? All those unsolved mysteries, those plot holes the author had neglected to fill, and now Shen Qingqiu had to grab a shovel and sweat away, filling them in himself. Ah! Great master, airplane shooting towards the sky, had claimed that proud immortal demon Wei's purpose was perfectly clear, and that each word had been written with a single goal in mind, to satisfy the reader. This was especially evident in how, in the future, the OP male lead would play innocent, a wolf in sheep's clothing, hunting other wolves, exacting revenge against lowlives, generating enough satisfaction to overturn the heavens. Thus, the work's popularity had swelled rapidly as it grew longer and longer, until no foot-binding cloth could compare to its length. Keeping track of the plot had been stressful even as a reader. Insane landmines were everywhere. How could he manage to avoid all of them? What kind of plot would qualify as not nonsensical? Shen Qingqiu asked. The standard is subjectively determined. It depends on the reader's reactions. Then how many points do I need to collect to launch a beginner-level quest? The timing is situationally determined. When the requirements have been met, the system will automatically notify you. Subjectively determined, situationally determined. What an all-purpose remedy, Shen Qingqiu scoffed. Then, upon hearing the door open, looked back to see a youth slowly walk in. Shizun, the youth spoke respectfully, even though his movements were unsteady, and he still managed to stand perfectly straight. The small smile that had been forming at the corner of Shen Qingqiu's mouth froze. He was definitely dead. Before him was the face that would, in the future, infatuate everyone who saw it, from 80-year-old women to infants and still in their swaddling clothes, the Gary Stew protagonist's face, and he'd beaten it to this extent? He was dead! But even though this face bore clear evidence of abuse and was covered in injuries, the protagonist was, as expected, still the protagonist. Lu Binghe's 2 eyes were as bright as morning stars, a tender shoot of a handsome young man. That firm yet humble countenance, demonstrating his noble and unyielding spirit. That pencil straight back and stance, evincing a proud core that would rather break than bend. In that instant, a flood of parallelisms and other stylistic devices flooded through Shen Qingqiu's heart, passage after passage jumbling together into countless stanzas of praise that almost spilled forth out of his mouth. Luckily, Shen Qingqiu managed to rein it in, albeit while internally yelling about how close he'd come. The underlying hardware of this protagonist's halo of excellent was really too much. He almost couldn't hold it back. Shen Qingqiu's mouth twitched as he watched Lu Binghe limp through the door, then struggle to kneel. I can't afford your submission. If you pay respects to me today, you are definitely going to kneecap me in the future. No need. Shen Qingqiu stopped Lu Binghe, and with a flick of his wrist he tossed over a small bottle. This is medicine. He paused before adding in a mocking tone, Don't let anyone see. They might think my Qingjing Peak abuses its disciples. Shen Qingqiu had assumed his role quickly. Even though he'd done something daringly subversive by handing over medicine, he'd also done it with a nasty attitude. Therefore it was passably in line with Shen Qingqiu's hypocritical nature, his tendency to do evil while he simultaneously feared others finding out. Indeed, the system didn't send an OOC notification. Shen Qingqiu let out a sigh of relief. Lu Binghe had expected that his master had called him for further instruction. He never would have thought he would be offered medicine. At first he froze, then he respectfully received the small bottle with both hands, and said with honest gratitude, Thank you for the medicine, Shizun. At this point in time, Lu Binghe's face was still full of innocence, his smile sincere and gentle, like the warm dawning sun. Shen Qingqiu stared at it for a while, then turned his head away. Prior to his darkening, this male lead's personality was that of a model and upright youth. Shine a bit of sunlight on him and he'd glow. Give him a scrap of goodwill and he'd return it tenfold. That type. It would not have been an exaggeration to call him a little lamp. This disciple will henceforth redouble his efforts and not let Shizun be disappointed, Lu Binghe happily continued. Oh no, if you redouble your efforts, I'm guessing your original master would really be disappointed. If Shen Qingqiu hadn't read The Proud Immortal Demon Way, he would have found the sight of this scene heart-wrenching, and he probably would have shed a couple of sympathetic tears for Lu Binghe's plight. As it was, he'd seen everything from beginning to end from an omniscient perspective, so he'd been privy to Lu Binghe's plentiful and colorful thoughts post-blackening. To wit, Lu Binghe's current pitifulness directly correlated to the future ferocity of his wanton laughter as he ground his foot into your head. Though he would wear the mask of a kind and humble gentleman, inside all his thoughts would be about how he'd rip out your tendons, pull out your bones, peel off your skin, and hang it all out to dry. Lu Binghe smiled. Today the humiliation this disciple once suffered will be returned 100-fold. For injuring my hands and feet, I'll tear off your limbs and grind them to dust. Proud Immortal Demon Way, selected passage number 2. After that, he had in actual fact carved Shen Qingqiu into a human stick. Binghe, how's your cultivation progress? Shen Qingqiu asked in a deliberately aloof tone as he moved to sit in a sandalwood chair. With that single Binghe, he terrified himself to the point that frightened goosebumps rose all down his back. Lu Binghe's back also shook with a clear shudder, but he still managed a smile tinged with shyness. This disciple is stupid and still failed to understand. That was about right. With a fake cultivation manual, the fact that he hadn't yet suffered a chi deviation was all thanks to his incredible protagonist-level durability. If he'd actually understood anything in that manual, it would have been a miracle. Boy, come hang out with me, Shen Qingqiu yelled within his heart. This master will deliver unto you the correct techniques. That demonic systems warning notification started blaring incessantly. I was only thinking about it, Shen Qingqiu said to the system. Of course I know it would be a violation. Out loud, he spoke casually. Today this master punished you out of his own impatience. After all, time waits for no one. Now that I think about it, you've been under me for a while. How old are you this year? This disciple is 14, Lu Binghe obediently replied. 14, huh? That means that at this point, this master and this disciple, Shen Qingqiu and Lu Binghe, had already passed the incident at the mountain entrance. There, the latter had been forced to kneel as a punishment. It meant that they had also passed the incident where Lu Binghe's fellow Qingjing Peak disciples had pummeled him en masse, as well as the incident where he'd back-talked Shizun and been strung up and beaten, in addition to the incident where he'd ruined the Peak's talisman and been punished with hard labor. Such a glorious track record. Shen Qingqiu waved goodbye to his last hope of survival. Shen Qingqiu rested his forehead in one hand and waved Lu Binghe away with the other. I wish to be alone. Shen Qingqiu was an easygoing person. Since his residential address had already changed to Proud Immortal Demon Way, and since he'd already kicked the bucket in his original world, he figured he might as well try making it work here. He'd arrived in a cultivation setting, received a body with decent martial ability and swordsmanship for free, and was also part of a famous righteous sect. If he wanted to stand out, he could stand out, and if he wanted to lay low, he could hole up on Changqiong's mountain sect's Qingjing Peak and be a recluse. What was there to complain about? The only slightly difficult thing would be finding a girlfriend. In this, sort of male power fantasy stallion novel, any woman inevitably belonged to the male lead, as long as she wasn't ugly. Everyone knew this. Still, Shen Qingzhou was a man of few needs. He would have been satisfied just idling away to a ripe old age. In that way, it wouldn't have been that different from how his previous life had been going. However, while Lu Binghe was a factor, making a name for himself was right out. If Shen Qingzhou remained anywhere near the original work setting, even if he found some non-existent paradise to seclude himself in, once Lu Binghe took power, he'd still be able to carve Shen Qingzhou into a human stick. It's not that I don't want to cling to the male lead's thighs, but who made him so damn black-hearted? He's the type who seeks thousandfold retribution. After his daily cursing at Great Master Airplane, Shen Qingzhou quickly set some goals. In short, familiarize himself with his environment, work with the system as much as possible, diligently pursue more accomplishments, earn B points, and unfreeze the OOC function as soon as possible. If the situation started looking grim, he'd have to seek out an alternative strategy. Zhang Xiang's 12 peaks were like 12 giant swords, forged by nature, steep and magnificent, piercing the skies. Shen Qingzhou's Qingjing Peak wasn't the tallest, but it was the most tranquil, heavily forested with tall bamboo. On top of that, as basically all of Shen Qingzhou's disciples needed to learn the 4 scholarly arts of Guqin playing, Go, calligraphy and painting, from time to time the clear sounds of reading and the murmur of the Guqin would drift on the breeze. It was an excellent destination for scholarly youths, steeped in ancient arts and literature, and perfectly aligned with the needs of the original Shen Qingzhou, that poser. As Shen Qingzhou passed a group of disciples, they respectfully asked after his health. He schooled his countenance to match the original's cold, aloof look, nodding slightly while walking with his hands clasped behind his back. He managed to get by with this, troubled only over how he was supposed to match the book's names to these wavering faces. This wasn't Shen Qingzhou's most pressing concern, however. That was self-defense, and for that he needed to figure out how to employ the original flavor's martial ability and swordsmanship. If he remembered correctly, before Lu Binghe darkened, Zhangjiang Mountain sect suffered a succession of significant incidents, things like demonic incursions and the Immortal Alliance Conference. Shen Qingzhou would have to deal with all of them. If all he had to work with was a shell with no cultivation ability, forget following the plot, the male lead wouldn't have to lift a finger before an insignificant no-name monster got him killed. Shen Qingzhou walked deep into the forest, alone. Only after confirming no one was in sight did he remove the sword at his waist. He held the scabbard in his left hand and the hilt in his right, and he slowly pulled it out. Shu Ya had been with Shen Qingzhou since he was young and newly known, and it could have been considered prestigious unto itself. The flash of its blade was snow white, luminous but not blinding, definitely a top-class armament. When one channeled spiritual energy into the weapon, the blade glowed faintly. As Shen Qingzhou pondered exactly how to channel spiritual energy, the sword in his hand began to shimmer white. It seemed like it inherited the original's cultivation and martial abilities as well. His mind had filled in the gaps without him needing to consciously remember. Wanting to see Shu Ya's power, Shen Qingzhou casually slashed once. Who knew a single slash would be so terrifying? The sword's arc dazzled like a flash of lightning released from his palm, so bright that even UV 400 sunglasses wouldn't have saved him if he hadn't closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he beheld a deep ditch that had been carved into the ground as if it had been split by lightning. Holy shit! Shen Qingzhou remained expressionless, but his heart surged with exhilaration. So damn awesome! Power worthy of a character who was a peak soul master. With this level of cultivation, if he diligently trained for the next 20 years, then maybe in the future, as a last resort, if he absolutely had to face that overpowered Lu Binghe, he might be able to flee in disgrace. Yes, all he wanted was to be able to flee in disgrace. He wanted to practice more, but he heard the sound of subtle footsteps snapping dry twigs. In truth, that sound was still a long way off, but his 5 senses were highly sensitive, and it would have been difficult not to notice. Shen Qingqiu studied that deep ditch in the ground, then sheathed his sword with a clink before hiding himself within the greenery. The footsteps came closer and closer. There was more than one person. As expected, a moment later the first face to appear was Lu Binghe's, seeming to shine with its own light. The first sound, however, was the crisp, delicate voice of a young maiden. "Alua, Alua, look! There's a huge ditch in the ground!" Upon hearing this nickname, Shen Qingqiu almost staggered from his hiding place. "Shen Qingqiu's youngest female disciple, Ning Ying Ying," the system said concisely. "What use was that introduction?" Shen Qingqiu hissed. "Everyone knows that only one person addresses Lu Binghe that way." The pretty girl following Lu Binghe came into view as well. She looked slightly younger than Lu Binghe, lovely and adorable, her braided hair bound with orange ribbons as she ran and skipped, brimming with naivety. Every proper cultivation novel had to have a charming young Shimei type. This young Shimei inspired some complicated feelings in Shen Qingqiu. This was because he had designs on Ning Ying Ying. No, more like the original Shen Qingqiu had designs on Ning Ying Ying. Shen Qingqiu's character's settings were stuck on shady hypocrite, since on the surface he looked pure-hearted, free of desire, and immune to wicked temptations. Then beneath that surface he had to be immoral, shameless, scummy, and despicable. He was a teacher, but he harbored filthy intentions towards his obedient and cheerful disciple. He tried to carry them out several times in the story, and he very nearly succeeded. One can, however, imagine the result of daring to try to get a taste of the male lead's woman. While reading, Shen Qingqiu had thought it a little strange that Lu Binghe hadn't tried to castrate the creep. His failure to do so absolutely didn't jive with Binghe's dark charm. So he'd gone to the comment section and joined the mob in flooding it with posts to the tune of, "Please castrate Shen Qingqiu. No castration, we unsubscribe." Upon reflection and closer consideration, Shen Qingqiu was profoundly terrified. If the appeal had succeeded then, he'd absolutely have to chop off the right hand with which he'd made those posts. Lu Binghe glanced over once, and offered only a half-hearted smile. But Ning Ying Ying wanted his attention, and she fumbled around for something to say. "Tell me, Alua, if Xiang was practicing their sword glares out here." "On Qingjing Peak, I'm afraid only Shizun has this level of cultivation," Lu Binghe answered as he picked up an axe and started chopping at a tree. He only spoke one line, then paid her no more heed. His focus was entirely on his own actions as he raised and lowered the axe, chopping in earnest. These trees were neither thin nor weak, and the axe was half rusted. At this time, Lu Binghe was only 14 years old, so chopping was tremendously taxing. Soon, sweat poured down his face. Ning Ying Ying sat on an old log, watching him with her face propped in her hands. After a while, she was bored again, and wheedled, "Alua, Alua, play with me." "I can't." Lu Binghe didn't even have the time to wipe away his sweat. He continued to swing the axe as he spoke. "Our Xiang told me that after I finish chopping today's wood, I also have to carry the water. If I finish chopping quickly, I can clear out some time to meditate." "Our Xiang are really awful, always making you do this and that. It looks to me like they're bullying you on purpose," Ning Ying Ying pouted. "I'll go back and tell Shizun. Once I do, they won't dare bully you anymore." Until this point, Shen Qingqiu had been treating this experience like he was at a shoot for a scene of a proud immortal demon way drama, just passing through, and enjoying a tale of 2 childhood sweethearts. Upon hearing this, he paled in shock. No, you absolutely can't come to me. What am I supposed to do? I can't be OOC. Who exactly should I punish?" But at this time, Even while the young Luo Binghe was experiencing the full depth and breadth of humanity's hardships, he still had the pure heart of a white lotus. He shook his head at Ning Ying. Absolutely not. I don't want to trouble Shizun with these small matters. Our Xiang didn't mean any harm. They just see that I'm young and want to give me more chances to train. In that instant, Shen Qingqiu could almost see 10,000 rays of light behind Luo Binghe. He couldn't help but back up 3 steps, unable to directly look at the male lead who had achieved such a transcendent state of being, who had attained such profound enlightenment. While Ning Ying chattered, Luo Binghe finished chopping his quota of wood. Putting the axe away, he found a random patch of relatively clean ground and sat down cross-legged with his eyes closed. Inside his heart, Shen Qingqiu released a long sigh. In truth, even during the early misery-ridden part of the storyline, the protagonist's overpowered nature had already started to emerge. The cultivation manual Ming Fan had given Luo Binghe was a fake. The more he trained by following it, the more his techniques should have degraded until they were absolute rubbish. But with his peerless talent and his body's half-demon blood, Luo Binghe had managed to eke out a path of his own by complete accident. It was entirely unscientific. While Shen Qingqiu sighed, there came the sound of another set of jumbled footsteps. As soon as he heard them, Shen Qingqiu knew that what was coming couldn't be good. Ming Fan stepped out onto the clearing, leading several low-ranked disciples. Upon seeing Ning Ying, he delightedly strode up and grabbed her hand. Xiao Shimei, I finally found you! How could you have come to a place like this without saying anything? The backside of the mountain is so large. What if some dangerous beast or poisonous snake leapt out? Come, Xiang has something fun to show you. Naturally, Ming Fan saw Luo Binghe sitting silently nearby, but he ignored the other boy as if he were nothing but air. However, Luo Binghe, being very well-mannered, opened his eyes and spoke. Xiang, I'm not afraid of poisonous snakes or dangerous beasts, Ning Ying giggled. Besides, isn't Alua with me? Ming Fan swept his gaze towards Luo Binghe, squinted, and scoffed. To Shen Qingqiu, Ming Fan's thoughts couldn't have been clearer. He heard the affectionate way Ning Ying addressed Luo Binghe, and in that moment his annoying Shidi had become even more irritating. In the end, Ning Ying had a young girl's disposition, completely unable to take a hint or read the room. What fun thing does Xiang have? She asked, head tilted. Hurry up and show me! Ming Fan became out smiles. He unfastened a deep green jade ornament from his waist and held it in front of her. Shimei, my family just came to visit and they brought me lots of high quality and interesting little trinkets. I thought this one was particularly pretty. I'll give it to you. Ning Ying took it from him and examined it closely in the sunlight shining through the leaves. Well, do you like it? Ming Fan asked eagerly. From his hiding place, Shen Qingqiu finally remembered. This was that scene. Not good. He shouldn't have come here. Danger! He couldn't be blamed for not remembering clearly. How could someone who'd cursed dumbfuck author, dumbfuck novel, remember ancient content from the beginning of a serialized novel that had been running for 4 years and covered an in-narrative span of 200 years? He'd spent 20 days bringing the novel from start to finish, so he had clean forgotten that one-filled arc of pointless abuse that covered Luo Binghe's beginning at the sect, okay? Ning Ying had absolutely no idea what was high quality and what wasn't. After looking nonchalantly at it for a while, she tossed the jade ornament back. Ming Fan's smile froze on his face. What? This color's so ugly. The one Alua has is prettier, Ning Ying said carelessly as she wrinkled her nose. Not only did Ming Fan look unhappy, but Luo Binghe, who'd been wisely pretending to not exist, trembled lightly as his eyes snapped open. Does Shidi also wear this kind of thing? Ming Fan spat through gritted teeth. Luo Binghe hesitated slightly. He hadn't managed to answer when Ning Ying barged in. Of course he does. Every day he wears it close around his neck. It's his treasure. He refuses to even let me look at it. Although Lu Binghe was usually so composed, at this point his expression also changed. He unconsciously clutched the Goddess of Mercy Guanyin pendant around his neck, hidden beneath his clothes. Your IQ and EQ, young lady. The male lead is taking all the collateral damage. Ning Yingying absolutely hadn't considered the consequences of these words as she said them. She'd only been thinking of how she always saw Lu Binghe wearing that jade guanyin close to his skin, never parting with it. Girls, in particular, inevitably wanted to get their hands on the things their crushes treasured, which they hoped would confer upon them the satisfaction of being in a special position. But Lu Binghe simply refused to give her that recognition. Displeased, she brought it up in this half-sweet, half-brazen manner. Of course he'd refused, okay? Lu Binghe's washerwoman mother had spent almost her entire life savings to finally, with great difficulty, give her son the consecrated protective charm she wanted for him. It was the only bit of warmth in Lu Binghe's dark world, always by his side, and even in the future, when he was at his darkest, it could summon up his last dregs of humanity, so how could he randomly hand it to anyone else? Mingfan, both angry and jealous, advanced a few steps. Lu Shidi, are you sure I was stuck up, refusing to show Ningying Shimei your pendant? He snarled. If this keeps up, when we face strong enemies in the future, will you refuse to even lend a hand? Young man, there's definitely a logical gap between your first and second lines. It's fine if he doesn't want to, Xiang. Don't bully him. Ning Ying hadn't thought things would turn out like this, and she anxiously stamped her feet. How could Lu Binghe best Mingfan at this point? Not to mention a group of junior disciples who were Mingfan's lackeys were also ganging up on him. In a moment, that jade guanyin fell from Lu Binghe's neck into Mingfan's hand. Mingfan raised it up for a look, then suddenly laughed loudly. Why are you laughing? Ning Ying said, confused. I thought it had to be some rare treasure for him to protect it so fiercely. Shimei, guess what it is? Mingfan tossed the jade pendant into Ning Ying's hands, positively gleeful as he chuckled. It's a counterfeit. Counterfeit? Ning Ying asked. What's that? Give it back! Lu Binghe enunciated each word. His fist slowly clenched, a treacherous undercurrent surging in the depths of his eyes. Shan Qingqiu's fingers involuntarily twitched once, then again and again. Naturally, he remembered that the jade guanyin was a counterfeit. He also knew that it was Lu Binghe's biggest berserk button. For an entire year, the washerwoman had scrimped and saved on food and utilities, but because she lacked experience, a con man had tricked her into paying a high price for a fake charm. Heartbroken after this, her body had steadily deteriorated. Lu Binghe would undoubtedly be unable to forget this pain for the rest of his life. This was the one insult that Lu Binghe could never tolerate. As a bystander, Shan Qingqiu desperately wanted to reach out, beat up Mingfan, snatch back the jade pendant, and toss it to Lu Binghe. Also, if he did that, maybe Mingfan wouldn't thoroughly offend Lu Binghe. Then, later on, he could keep his paltry little life. Oh, I see. Thank you, shut up. You want it back? I'll give it back. Who knows which street stall this cheap thing was purchased from? Mingfan plucked the pendant from Ning Ying's hand, disgust in his tone. I'm afraid giving it to Shimei would dirty her hands. So he said, but he had not the slightest intention of returning it. Lu Binghe's face was tight. Suddenly, he struck out with both fists, hitting the couple of low-ranked disciples restraining him. Enraged as he was, his blows were not directed by technique. They were random strikes fueled by the anger within. At first he managed to cow these low-ranked disciples, but they quickly realized that he was in truth incredibly weak, and that only his demeanor was impressive. Also, Mengfen was snarling at them. "What are you standing there for? He dared to attack us, Xiang. Teach him what it means to respect seniority." At this, they all regained their courage and surrounded Lu Binghe, clubbering him. Ning Ying was scared stiff, her pitiful brain capacity still not understanding how things had progressed to this state. "Xiang," she cried, "how could you do this? Hurry up and tell him to stop, or I'll never talk to you again." "Shimei, don't be angry," Mingfen said in a panic. "I'll tell him to stop hitting this guy, okay?" He was distracted. Before he finished speaking, Lu Binghe broke free from the many arms and legs entangling him and sent a fist into Mingfen's nose. A wild wail, 2 twin streams of fresh blood jetted from Mingfen's nostrils. Although she had been about to burst into tears, at the sight of this, Ning Ying couldn't help but let out a stifled laugh. "Sister, really? Do you like Lu Binghe, or do you want to screw him over?" Shen Qingqiu howled in his head. Before this point, Mingfen might feasibly have let Lu Binghe go, but now that he'd been humiliated in front of his crush, he couldn't back down, no matter what. The 2 boys twisted into a fighting heap, but no matter how exceptional Lu Binghe's talent, he was still young and he hadn't been cultivating with proper instruction. It was, for the most part, a one-sided beatdown. Yet Lu Binghe remained silent, teeth clenched. Shen Qingqiu wanted desperately to intervene, but the system exploded with a terrifying cascade of alarms. "Severe OOC! Severe OOC! Severe OOC! Important things must be repeated 3 times. In this situation, Shen Qingqiu would choose to smile. He would watch from the sidelines, hands in his sleeves, or personally beat Lu Binghe himself." Was it really going to make him look on while a child was being abused? This was really too much. Even so, Shen Qingqiu couldn't afford to take risks. While he was anxiously fretting, a compromise suddenly came to him. Jiangcheng Mountain sect had a minor technique, plucking leaves, flying flowers. At a glance it wasn't very useful, just aesthetic and interesting. The novel had described how Lu Binghe used the technique to win the nth woman's affection. As Shen Qingqiu had, since his arrival, been furiously reviewing various manuals, he had also recently seen a description of it. He plucked a nearby leaf and channeled a touch of spiritual power into it. The first time he channeled too much. The leaf couldn't withstand his power and instantly split into several pieces. He succeeded the second time, held the leaf between his fingertips, and gently blew, letting it go. The leaf shot towards Mingfen like an airborne knife. As Mingfen's long and horrible scream split the air, Shen Qingqiu shook out his hand and wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. No wonder they said that to an expert. Even a flower or tree could be used to hurt people. But he hadn't killed Mingfen just now, right? Lu Binghe had suffered quite a few punches and kicks, but suddenly it was Mingfen who staggered backwards. Lu Binghe looked up. Flesh blood dripped from his forehead past his eyes, but he hadn't expected to see Mingfen stretching out his own hand, his palm also covered in blood. Mingfen stared in disbelief. "You dare to use a knife?" Due to its fierceness, Ning Ying hadn't risked coming close to their fight, but now she hurried to throw herself between the two. No, Alua didn't use a knife. It wasn't him." Lu Binghe also had no idea what happened. He closed his mouth tightly and tried to clean the blood from his face. "Did you see clearly? Was he holding a knife?" Mingfen interrogated the other disciple as blood seeped out of his back like he'd been cut with the edge of a sword. The disciples looked around at each other in complete disarray, some shaking their heads, some nodding. Mingfen was a spoiled and pampered young master, and he had never suffered this level of physical pain. The sight of his own hand covered with blood sent panic surging through his heart. The puzzling thing was that there was no evidence of a weapon either on the ground or on Lu Binghe's slender person. It couldn't have vanished in thin air, could it? Shen Qingqiu held his breath. His vision suddenly flashed red, and a huge line of floating text popped up before him in a blood red as eye-catching as it was bone-chilling. Violation, OOC, B points -10, current B points 90. Shan Qingqiu released his breath, relieved. He'd been prepared for a deduction in the realm of 50, or even to lose everything. Only 10 was much better than he'd thought. He'd take the loss for now. There would be future chances to earn those points back. Then, shortly after he let out his breath, Mingfen pointed to Luo Binghe and yelled, "Get him!" Shan Qingqiu nearly vomited a mouthful of blood straight from his chest. The gang of disciples heard the order and tackled Luo Binghe. Shan Qingqiu unconsciously tore off a handful of nearby leaves and sent them all singing through the air. He regretted it as soon as they left his hand. The fuck am I doing? No matter what happens, Luo Binghe is the magnificent male lead. It's not like he's never been ganged up on before. Like, they could beat him to death? Like hell, you need to worry about yourself. He might have gotten away with the first interference, but now? Fantastic. Even an idiot would notice something was off. Numerous disciples were splattered with blood. They anxiously gathered around Mingfen, no longer daring to gang up on Luo Binghe. "Xiang, what's going on? Xiang, I've also been cut!" Mingfen's face was green and white. Only after a long moment did he yell out, "Go!" Leading his group of lackeys, all covering their backs and holding their arms, he frantically withdrew. They truly came like the wind and left like it too. Only Ning Ying Ying remained, standing there dumbly for a while. Then she shouted, "Luo, were you the one who sent them running just now?" Luo Binghe shook his head, expression gloomy. He stood up, straightening with difficulty. Then he bent down again with a tense look, searching the ground for something, turning over fallen leaves, dry twigs, and mud this way and that way, over and over again. Shan Qingqiu knew what he was looking for. Naturally, it was that jade pendant, which had been lost in the confusion. He saw it clear as day. Before fighting, Mingfen had swung out his arm, and as he did, the pendant's red string had snagged on a branch high above their heads. But Shan Qingqiu couldn't point that out. Also, just after he'd sent the leaves flying, he'd heard that heart-shattering system scream. Violation, OOC, B points -10 × 6, current B points 30. In an instant, he'd fallen below a passing grade. So 1 leaf equals 10 points? Don't use such simple, crude arithmetic! Ning Ying Ying didn't dare speak. After all, she had caused this entire affair. If not for her big mouth, Luo Binghe would have never suffered a beating. And on top of that, he'd lost his pendant for no good reason. She swiftly began to help Luo Binghe in his search. They, of course, remained empty-handed, even as it became dark. Luo Binghe stood dumbly in one place, staring at the mess of the ground. They had overturned every speck of dirt in sight, but still they hadn't found it. "Luo, if we can't find it, let's just let it be," said Ning Ying Ying. A little frightened to see him so dazed and out of his mind, she took his hand. "I'm sorry, I'll buy you another one later, all right?" Luo Binghe paid her no heed. He slowly withdrew his hand and walked towards the forest edge, head lowered. Ning Ying Ying hurried after him. Shan Qingqiu was truly impressed with himself. These two children had searched for an entire afternoon, and he'd actually gone and watched the whole time. How could he explain that to himself, other than to say that he had too much fucking time on his hands? He waited until they had gone a good distance, then finally emerged from his hiding place. He raised his head and looked about, then tapped his foot on the ground. In that moment, he experienced what it meant to have a body as light as a swallow, and with great ease he rose and plucked that jade pendant from where it was caught on a branch. In truth, Shan Qingqiu wanted to secretly return it to Luo Binghe, but he was now familiar with the system rules. That would definitely count as a violation. He didn't have any more B points to squander. After some thought, Shan Qingqiu decided to keep it for the time being. Maybe later this jade pendant would be of great use. For example, perhaps during a critical moment, when his fate hung by a thread, he could bargain it in exchange for his life? Xiang Qingqiu gave this possibility serious consideration. Right then, a line of green text with a pronounced 3D effect jumped into view. Congratulations! Obtained key item. Fei Jade Guanyin. 1. For changing the storyline, Xiang Qingqiu IQ plus 100. Current B points 130. Please continue to work hard. All the points that had just been deducted were not only restored, he even got more? On top of that, given the influence this Jade Guanyin had on Luo Binghe, it was definitely a high-level item, and it could be used to preserve his life. What a happy surprise! A rush of satisfaction flowed through Xiang Qingqiu, cleansing him of the gloom that had set in while he crouched in the dark for a whole afternoon. At this moment, even the system's eminently punchable Google Translate-like voice was melodious beyond compare. Meanwhile, outside the forest, Luo Binghe had already left the back of the mountain, and he slowly unclenched his fist. Lying in his palm was a whole green leaf. Its edges were sharp and stained with blood. In the days of Xiang Qingqiu's recuperation, following his awakening from that inexplicable fever, Yu Jingwang came to visit him many times. As a sect leader of the world's foremost major cultivation sect, which might be likened to being the principal of a comprehensive cultivation university, his workload had to be heavy. Yet he was still so considerate to his Shidi. As a stranger in a strange land, Xiang Qingqiu practically wanted to shed tears of gratitude. Though the original flavor had actually turned on such a kind superior and fellow disciple that he had breached their brotherly covenant just like that, it made clear how much of a scumbag he was. Now that Shidi has rested for several days, has your health improved? Yue Qingyuan asked, his eyes full of earnest concern as he held one of the bamboo house's porcelain tea bowls. I have long since recovered, said Xiang Qingqiu lightly, waving his folding fan and feeling at home in the atmosphere of brotherly love. I've caused Xinxiang such trouble, making him worry. Then I suppose it's about time for Shidi to leave the mountains, said Yue Qingyuan. Is there anything you need? The hand Xiang Qingqiu was using to fan himself froze. Leave the mountains? Did the illness make you forget? Yue Qingyuan asked, surprised. Did the illness make you forget? Yue Qingyuan asked, surprised. Didn't you tell me before to leave the matter of Shanghu City to you as a training opportunity for your disciples? So it was some troublesome project undertaken by the original Xiang Qingqiu. But while Xiang Qingqiu had been familiarizing himself with his body's spiritual power and techniques, they still weren't second nature. How could he take disciples down from the mountain for training? Just as he was about to summon his resolve and embarrass himself, to renege and say that his body wasn't well after all, the system's unfeeling voice reverberated in his skull. Beginner level quest issued. Location, Shanghu City. Quest, complete the training. Please click to accept. At the same time, the quest synopsis popped up before him with two options on the bottom. The left saying accept, the right saying reject. So this was a beginner level quest. Xiang Qingqiu's gaze lingered on accept for a while. The option blinked green. A ding sounded, and the system said, Quest successfully accepted. Please thoroughly read the provided files and make your preparations. We wish you a swift success. Xiang Qingqiu came back to himself. Naturally, I remember, he said while smiling. It's just that these days I've rested too much and grown slow. I'd almost forgotten about this matter. I'll head out in a few days. Yue Qingyuan nodded. If you're not completely recovered, there's no need to force yourself. There's no rush to train your disciples either. You especially don't need to personally take care of this matter. Xiang Qingqiu agreed, still smiling, but he couldn't help giving Yue Qingyuan two extra glances. Shangman Xinxiong, your current role is getting a bit too much like a quest-giving NPC. All affairs on Qingjing Peak, whether large or small, were handled to and looked after by Xiang Qingqiu's trusted subordinate, Ming Fan. Xiang Qingqiu had discovered that in matters that didn't involve a certain protagonist, Ming Fan was surprisingly efficient and intelligent. They were able to set out the following day. Before leaving Qingjing Peak, Xiang Qingqiu briefly inspected his appearance. Teal robes, loose sash, sorted left hip, fan in right hand, elegant, cultured, reliable, graceful. A properly otherworldly being. In short, absolutely not OOC. Perfect. At the bottom of the long 100-step stone stairway, waiting by the mountain gates, was the carriage prepared for Shan Qingqiu, as well as a collection of horses for his accompanying disciples. Are you kidding? Shan Qingqiu muttered in his head. In the end, this is still a cultivation setting. Why aren't we flying on swords? Even in a magical setting like Harry Potter, not every wizard goes out riding brooms, the system coolly replied. It would be too conspicuous. You are knowledgeable, Shan Qingqiu muttered. Did you do business over at Harry Potter's before? The system typed out a giant line of hovering symbols. In all these years of the system's operation, Shan Qingqiu might have been the first person bored enough to act so familiarly with it, let alone to fuck around with it. On the other hand, if you thought about it, this setup made sense. This trip down the mountain was for the sake of training, and the majority of these disciples were young and lacked experience. They hadn't even claimed their personal swords yet. According to the traditions of Jiangqiang Mountain sect, only once the disciples' cultivation reached a certain stage, they would go to Wanjian Peak, one of the 12 peaks, to pick a suitable blade. There it was said that the person picked the sword. In truth, the sword also picked the person. If a person with subpar talent insisted on taking a top-class sword capable of condensing spiritual energy collected from the heavens and earth, it would be the equivalent of a beautiful woman marrying an ugly man or arranging fresh flowers in cow dung. As you can imagine, the sword would be entirely unwilling. Lu Binghe's real golden finger only activated when he came upon his own personal sword, the mystical Xin Mu. Shan Qingqiu entered the carriage. Its appearance wasn't especially ornate, but the interior was both spacious and comfortable, and the small incense burner faintly smoldered within. Once he sat, Shan Qingqiu had a sudden premonition that something wasn't quite right. He abruptly poked at his fan and raised it to lift the curtains. The second he looked outside, he felt he should have been struck blind by the sight. No wonder he thought that the silhouette hurrying back and forth around the carriage seemed familiar. The person everyone was ordering around to do miscellaneous tasks was none other than the great male lead, Lu Binghe. Just then, Lu Binghe hauled the last item onto the carriage, a wide jade chessboard that was mandatory luggage on all of Shan Qingqiu's trips, though it usually went unused. He raised his head to see Shan Qingqiu observing him with a complicated expression, and jolted slightly. Respectfully, he said, "Shizun." The injuries Lu Binghe had received from Shan Qingqiu's pre-fever discipline were just about healed. The bruises on his face had vanished, and one could finally clearly see what he looked like. Even though he was young, his features still soft and immature, no degree of youth could conceal the handsome grace within him. On top of that, he walked and moved with a shining air. Who would ever guess that this was Jingjing's Peak's most miserable flower bud, which had been ravished by wind and rain for many years? Although Lu Binghe was doing the rough work of moving luggage and equipment, his attitude was meticulous. It was hard not to be moved by that earnest and focused bearing. It was especially hard for Shan Qingqiu, who had already had some fondness for this male lead. He was indeed very fond of this ruthlessly decisive protagonist, who was so clear-cut with who deserved his kindness and who his hatred. After staring for a moment, Shan Qingqiu made an "oh" sound, then pulled back his fan, dropping the curtains. It had to be said, the male lead was inescapably the male lead. Even with how downtrodden this kid was, with no history, no prospects, nor parents to love him, it was no wonder that there were still so many first, second, third, and fourth female leads, ready to hang off his every word, trail in his wake, and otherwise throw themselves at him. Good looks were the true worry of the world. This also explained why there was always some cannon fodder or another who found him an eyesore and who wanted to vent by beating him until his head looked like a pig's. Then something else occurred to Chen Qingqiu. It's not right. If the total number of traveling disciples, including Lu Binghe, was 10, and there were only 9 horses, then aren't they missing one? Alright, even if he thought with his toes, he'd have known who to blame. As expected, Mingfan's gleeful voice cut through the snickering outside. Actually, we're short on horses, so we have no choice but to inconvenience Shidi this time. Although since Shidi's foundation is poor, it's perfect. You can also take this chance to train. Short on horses, my ass. In recent years, of all the major sects, Changjiang Mountain sect had become number 1 when it came to cultivation. It had no real business rivals. That it was overflowing with wealth could be left unsaid. In short, like they'd want even for a single horse. What? Mingfan paused, truly well-versed in digging his own cannon fodder grave. What sort of expression is that? You dissatisfied? I wouldn't dare, said Lu Binghe evenly, neither haughty nor humble. At this point, a young girl's bell-like laugh caught the ear. Ning Yingying had arrived. Xiang, what are you two talking about? Chen Qingqiu held his forehead. Really, young lady, your timing. Ning Yingying was a powerful catalyst in the continued worsening of Mingfan's and Lu Binghe's relationship. Once again, Chen Qingqiu tentatively lifted the carriage curtains a little, dithering over whether he should speak. As expected, he beheld Ning Yingying excitedly waving her hand. Alwa, not enough horses? Come ride with me! She really does bring a lot of hatred on Lu Binghe. So it is known, although this type of plot, wherein the downtrodden protagonist receives special attention from a beauty, is a satisfying trope often seen on Zhongjian literature, it is also the likeliest to incite the envy of others and subsequent persecution. In this moment, if Lu Binghe accepted Ning Yingying's suggestion, he could forget about getting any peace on this trip. Chen Qingqiu could no longer sit by and bear it. Yingying, don't make a fuss. Men and women mustn't be too intimate. No matter how close you are with your shidi, there ought to be limits. Mingfan, we're dawdling. Why haven't we set out yet? Mingfan was overjoyed, no doubt thinking Shizun and I are on the same page. He hastily urged the group to depart. Ning Yingying pouted but said nothing. That little skit over for now, Chen Qingqiu let his mind wander from it and returned to silently reading the files spread out on his system desk. This trip wasn't to commemorate the first plotline to take him down the mountain. It was, most importantly, concerned with the beginner-level quest that would determine whether he could unfreeze the OOC function. Chen Qingqiu couldn't afford to treat it with anything but the utmost seriousness. The file described the location, a small city several tens of kilometers away from Changjiang Mountain sect. Recently, a number of murders had occurred within it. Already 9 people were dead. Every victim shared a common fate. The skin on their body had been completely, meticulously peeled off, from head to toe, and with perfect precision, as if the skin had never been attached to the deceased body at all. It was enough to horrify anyone. Therefore, the murder had come to be known as the Skinner Demon. The Skinner Demon's chosen victim were all young, beautiful women. Therefore, in Shuanghu City, every family with daughters, wives, or concubines shut and locked their doors the moment night fell. Despite this, they had been unable to stop the Skinner Demon from coming and going as it pleased. A succession of 9 horrible deaths, yet the officials had no idea what to do. The city's people were in a state of panic. There were even rumors that it was the work of a ghost. Otherwise, how could the culprit come and go without a trace? Several influential families had met together and at last decided to send someone to Changjiang Mountain sect to plead for assistance from the immortal cultivators. Chen Qingqiu had already read this information multiple times, but no matter how many times he read it, it wasn't the least bit helpful. The hell is a Skinner Demon? Never heard of it. Is this a newly added plotline or a hidden one? Is it dangerous? Is it strong? Am I even going to be able to deal with it? This isn't what we agreed to. In response to those questions, the system said, What isn't? You were once a novel reader. Novels are a type of artistic creation, and in any artistic creation, there are always decisions that must be made and things that must be left out. Now that you've become part of this world, you naturally have to experience everything yourself, regardless of importance. You must follow every plotline to the very end, even ones omitted from the original work. Shinjinchu had no say in any of it. As such, he had diligently trained for numerous days, single-mindedly seeking to make his abilities second nature, lest he croak at the hands of some no-name monster before he ever had the chance to die beneath the male lead's feet, like a general passing away before his first victory. Lu Binghe was still outside, so at no moment did Shen Qingqiu dare to relax his vigil, keeping an eye out for any untoward activity. At the same time, he rummaged through the carriage interior. Every comfort one could imagine was on hand. Shen Qingqiu managed to dredge up 5 or 6 different tea sets. No matter that in his past life he could have counted as a wealthy second gen, he still hadn't been this pointlessly indulgent in his pursuit of first-world affluenza, okay? At this time, a wave of cackles rolled in from outside the carriage. He swept a glance outside. Lu Binghe trailed alone at the back of the group, at times walking, at times running. From time to time horses encircled him, purposefully kicking up a cloud of dust until it was filthy and caked with it. Shen Qingqiu couldn't help clutching the handle of his fan, knuckles itching faintly. This was only a book, and all the people were constructs, imaginary characters. Logically, Shen Qingqiu was very clear on this fact, but when a character was actually being taunted and bullied right before his eyes, it was just flat-out unrealistic to expect him to be completely unmoved. Having attempted to dissuade them several times to no avail, Ning Yingying finally realized her interference only made things worse. She anxiously urged her horse towards the carriage and called out, "Shizun! The Xiang! Look at them!" "What about them?" Shen Qingqiu asked placidly, though his heart was moved. He didn't show it. "They're bullying someone so viciously, yet you're not telling them off," she said defiantly, her voice carrying with the strength of her indignation. "If they keep on like this, Shizun, what are you teaching your disciples to become?" Even though she was directly tattling on them, Mingfan and his lackeys didn't feel any pressure at all. They were all used to the prior Shen Qingqiu silently permitting these actions. The harsher their bullying of Lu Binghe, the happier they made their teacher. Why would they exercise restraint? Mingfan was happiest of all. He was so sure that on that day at the back of the mountain, Lu Binghe had used some manner of sorcery he'd learned from who knew where. Today, Shizun was here, and he'd be crushed. Shen Qingqiu made an "oh" sound. Then he spoke a single line. "Lu Binghe, come here." Lu Binghe's expression went blank. Accustomed to this call, he gave a quiet assent and walked over. At first, everyone was still riding high on schadenfreude, thinking that Shen Qingqiu was calling Lu Binghe over to grab him by the ear and discipline him. What happened next shattered their entire worldview. Shen Qingqiu used his fan to lift the curtains, then jerked his chin at Lu Binghe before shooting a glance at the carriage interior. Even though he didn't speak, the meaning couldn't have been clearer. "Ah, Lue, hurry and get on," Ning Ying said happily. "Shizun is letting you ride with him." Like thunder on a clear day. If they hadn't known their master so well and for so long, Mingfan and his fellows would have suspected that Shen Qingqiu had been possessed by a demon. Lu Binghe had also frozen in astonishment, but his reaction was nevertheless swift. He paused for only a second before saying, "Many thanks to Shizun." Then he stepped into the carriage, ever conscientious, and sat straight backed in a corner. His hands and feet remained tucked in, like he was afraid that his patched clothes would dirty the interior. "Warning!" "Warning rejected," said Shen Qingqiu. "I wasn't OOC." Shen Qingqiu would never do anything to alleviate Lu Binghe's troubles. Verdict, OOC level 100%. "Have you carefully examined this character's complicated inner world?" Shen Qingqiu countered. "Of course he would never do anything purely to alleviate Lu Binghe's trouble, but right now my goal is to prevent Ning Yingying from losing faith in me as her teacher." Ying Ying is my dearest little disciple, and she begged me. How could I let her plea go unheard? So, my actions are completely in line with Shen Qingqiu's internal logic. Shen Qingqiu declared, your warning is invalid. During their exchange over the last couple of days, Shen Qingqiu had gradually figured out a handful of the system's quirks. It had rules, but these rules were not rigid. As was the case, there was a bit of leeway for bargaining. As he'd hoped, for the time being, the system couldn't think of an argument to enforce its deduction. Riding high on the delight of victory in his first battle, Shen Qingqiu couldn't help but laugh. However, Shen Qingqiu had in that moment been quietly sitting in the carriage, seemingly meditating with his eyes closed in a trance. When Luo Binghe suddenly heard him laugh, he couldn't resist stealing a glance at him. To tell the truth, it would have been a lie to say that Luo Binghe wasn't surprised. Even though he'd always revered Shen Qingqiu, he had no illusions about how his master treated and looked at him. At first he thought that if Shen Qingqiu asked him to get in the carriage, there must be something even more terrible waiting for him within, and he had mentally prepared himself for it. He hadn't expected Shen Qingqiu to not bother with him at all, instead focusing only on himself as he began to meditate. Luo Binghe thought for a moment. It seemed to him that he had never been this close to his teacher before, and that he had never had an opportunity to carefully examine Shen Qingqiu like this. Appearance-wise, you couldn't complain about him. Perhaps Shen Qingqiu couldn't qualify as supremely beautiful, but he was certainly good-looking, and you wouldn't tire of looking at him. The profile of his face in three-quarter view seemed to have been carved by creeks and mountain springs, and when not fixed in a cold scowl, it became gentle and bright. As soon as Shen Qingqiu opened his eyes, he found Luo Binghe staring at him. He saw a glimpse of the future Luo Binghe's unique grace, that of eyes like cold stars, a soft and radiant smile, with muted words and quiet laughter. Luo Binghe had been caught red-handed, and right as he was struck, lost as what to do, Shen Qingqiu smiled at him. This smile was purely unconscious, but Luo Binghe felt like he'd been pricked by a small, fine thorn. He quickly averted his gaze and became increasingly awkward, unsure of what he was feeling. Very soon, Shen Qingqiu couldn't bring himself to smile anymore. The system had delivered a notification. Violation, OOC, B points -5, current B points 165. Saith Shen Qingqiu, even a brief smile warrants a deduction. Saith the system most righteously, OOC is OOC.